Good morning, good afternoon to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has so far killed thousands of Ukrainians and displaced millions. Russia's actions and the follow-on response from Western countries have also thrown global oil and gas markets into turmoil with direct effects on the Gulf region. While keeping the plight of the victims of this war in mind, we're gathered virtually today to examine the impact of this conflict on the global energy markets and see what role, if any, Gulf energy producers can play to balance the market. With that, I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers. First, I'm happy to welcome Naji Abi-Aad. He is the Chief Operating Officer of Petroleb, a Beirut-based oil company active in offshore petroleum exploration in the Eastern Mediterranean and Gulf. Prior to his employment in Lebanon, he served for 7 years as a research advisor for Qatar Petroleum. He was also a media and research strategist in the Office of the Deputy Premier, Minister of Energy and Industry of Qatar. He was then appointed senior advisor to the CEO of Qatar Petroleum International. He has authored more than 100 reports and studies on Middle East energy issues, as well as a book on the security of petroleum supply from the region. Also happy to welcome Abi Imsirovic, Senior Research Fellow at the Oxford Energy Institute. He has over 30 years of experience in oil trading and has held a number of senior positions, including Global Head of Oil at Gazprom Marketing and Trading, Director of Petraco and the Head of their Singapore office, and Regional Manager of Texaco Oil Trading for Asia. He is the author of Trading and Price Discovery for Crude Oils, Growth and Development of International Oil Markets, published by Palgrave in August 2021. Last but not least is our friend Robin Mills. He is the CEO of Qamar Energy and a non-resident fellow at AGSIW. He has led major consulting assignments for the European Union and Iraq and for a variety of international oil companies on Middle East business development, integrated gas and power generation, and renewable energy. He is a fellow at the Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy, a senior fellow of the Iraq Energy Institute, and a columnist on energy and environment for the National and Bloomberg. I've been a keen reader of the newsletter that you're putting together for the National, and I recommend it for everyone, to everyone in our audience today. Moderating the session today is Kate Dourian, non-resident fellow at AGSIW and contributing editor at MEES and a fellow at the Energy Institute. Previously, she was the regional manager for the Middle East and Gulf states at the World Energy Council, as well as the program officer for the Middle East and North Africa at the International Energy Agency. And with that, Kate, over to you.
Thank you very much. And I welcome speakers, some of you are old friends, some of you are meeting virtually, and I hope to meet you again in person very, very soon. We've just come out of one crisis, which is why we haven't met in person, the COVID, and now we've got this crisis in Ukraine. And we wrote the session brief a week ago, basically saying that, there hadn't been sanctions on Russian energy directly, but of course, since then, we've had the UK and the US saying they're going to ban imports of Russian energy, that's oil, gas, coal. We already had a very tight situation on both the gas and oil markets. Of course, Russia is the biggest supplier of exporter of gas. Those haven't been interrupted yet, but we've seen disruption to oil even before the US and the UK announced sanctions. So it was already a tight market. It's tightening further. We've seen oil market volatility, oil price volatility like we haven't seen for more than for a decade. There's talk of alternative supplies, but these aren't immediate. We have certain countries that have spare production capacity. There have been calls on OPEC Plus to increase production, to use their spare capacity. But will that really make a difference? Because that would erode global spare capacity, most of which is held by Saudi Arabia. So far, OPEC Plus hasn't really heeded calls to increase production. Of course, Russia is part of that alliance. But we've seen also at the same time, we've seen all the major energy companies. We've seen BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, Equinor pulling out of their investments, a lot of them in LNG. So today we're going to be looking at the Gulf states in particular and whether they can help to stabilize this market, whether OPEC Plus can actually do anything with Russia possibly becoming a spent force in the energy world if their oil supply, oil exports are disrupted even further. So what is this shock going to do? I mean, we've seen prices at the moment, they're trading closer to 120 than 110, and they're sort of, at one point we saw them going up to 139 for Brent crude, and that's pretty close to the record we saw in 2008. So it's just looking at what the state of the market is at the moment, what the Gulf states can do. Obviously, there is oil, but they've been withholding, OPEC Plus has been withholding. And there was a very interesting headline the other day that I saw basically saying, these 13 minutes, OPEC Plus ministers met for 13 minutes in early March and decided to just increase gradually this 400,000 barrels a day, which is really a drop in the ocean when you consider that supply demand is about 100 million barrels a day. And it sort of basically said, the 13 minutes that showed OPEC Plus's irrelevance. So I'm going to start with our first speaker of the day, Adi. Could you give us an overview of what is actually happening at the moment with Russia under so many layers, a cascade of sanctions? And then we'll move on to see the other side of the coin, the Gulf states and the oil producers in the Gulf states and the gas, obviously, because Qatar is a big exporter as well, and what they can do, if anything, to stabilize this market. So Adi, over to you.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah, gosh, there's so much in here, and things, as you said, are changing by the minute. Well, let's just look at the big picture. Russia is one of the big three. Saudi Arabia, United States, and Russia, roughly give and take 10 million barrels a day. So it's huge. 10% of all the global supplies, and most of it really going to Europe. And Europe is the one under the microscope, even though we all know that, the oil market is one great pool. So it's not going to be Europe is going to be affected. Everyone else is going to be affected. China is being affected. Gasoline supplies to South America are going to be affected, and so on. Now, before we even start talking about politics and sanctions, we know the US and the UK have already applied the sanctions. UK is a little bit more vague. It's going to get phased out by the end of the year. But either way, for both countries, it's not a big deal, and for Russia, it's not a big deal. And surprise, that's why those two countries were the first to announce those sanctions, because the imports, Russian imports into the US are they obviously vary over time, about 7, 8, maximum 10%. And they're more in terms of quality rather than quantity. US started importing a lot more Russian oil after the sanctions on Venezuela, because the US Gulf refiners love heavy oils, and they found a substitute in Russian fuel oil, straight front, particularly fuel oil, and so on. So most of the Russian imports are really fuel oil in terms of quality. And it's no surprise, Kate, that you saw a US delegation going to Venezuela first. Because if they were to reach some sort of agreement in Venezuela, basically, cutting out Russia they would not even feel it. Out of 21 million barrels of demand a day, Russian imports have been up to about 500,000 barrels. That's a really drop in the ocean. For the UK, it's a little bit more serious. We're talking about maybe 10% of all the imports, and most of it being products. Excuse me. It's gas oil, distillates are going to be very, very tight as a result. But then they're going to be very, very tight for Europe as it is, because even the second biggest source of gas oil for the UK is Rotterdam, Holland, but primarily Rotterdam. They run a lot of Russian crude. So if they don't get enough Russian crude, then there's a sort of secondary effect. So it's a very difficult situation, but for these two countries, it's not a big deal. In terms of Russia is very worried about any sort of embargo on Russian crude, because they get almost half of their federal revenue from oil, a lot more than from gas. So they're quite worried. And I think the way they could potentially retaliate is to go back and say, well, if you've got to cut our oil, will cut your gas, and for Europe, gas is the other way around. Gas is far more important, and oil is far less important. Gas is far more important. Oil, well, it's very important, but not as much. In terms of situation with gas, I think it's particularly sensitive for Europe, because a couple of our guys, Mike Forward and Jack Sharples from the OIES, have done some work recently, very recently. And if we were to lose Russian gas, basically we would be struggling to meet our summer demand. And we know winter demand hell of a lot higher. Even with all the suggestions from the International Energy Agency, I think if we lost Russian supplies for gas, we would be down at least 50 BCM for the winter, at least, and probably more. So overall situation is quite serious. Now, going back to your original question, I'm sorry, I might have gone a bit sideways. We already seeing a loss of Russian supply effectively, even though the Russian loadings are there in place, they're not selling. They're not going. We saw last week that Russian crude, which normally trades Urals, which normally trades at about dated Brent minus $1.50, traded at minus $30, almost $28.40. Okay, so that's massive. That's massive. At the same time, we've seen doubling of the VLCC rates. We've seen tripling of the Afra rates. We've seen ships refusing to go to the Black Sea. We've seen India coming out and saying, well, we'll only buy Russian crude, even though, you know, India is a bottom feeder. They'll buy anything cheap. They just said, we don't want to buy anything FOB, we'll buy delivered. So Russian crude is struggling to move. So what we're saying right now that it's very hard to estimate. Sorry, Kate, here data is really like fuzzy because it's all day in, day out. But we see probably a loss of 2 million barrels, 3 million barrels just looking for home a day, that they can't find a home. And I think early on in our sort of pre-recording chat here, I said that SR Refinery has a ship coming in prior to UK sanctions, and the dock workers really refused to take it and just had to go away, even though it was a German vessel with Russian crew. They just refused to unload it. So I think that the key point here is that for most people, especially in Europe, because obviously this is hitting Europe a lot harder than everything else, any other place, is watching those scenes of, you know, on television. And I really don't want to go into any detail. It's fairly emotional, and it's very hard to say, okay, let's go and just give some more money to Putin.
Yeah. Thanks. Yes, we'll come back to it later on, you know, what you said about Venezuelan oil obviously being blended with the light crude because of the way the refineries in the Gulf, in the US Gulf are configured. And yes, again, the sort of the major energy companies appear to have found a sort of moral compass now, you know, withdrawing. And I'll come back to you later on about how this will impact in the longer term, you know, this once the crisis is over, how the withdrawal of this technology of investments is going to affect the Russian energy sector in the days ahead. I'm going to move on now to Robin Mills. Robin, who's based in Dubai, who sort of follows the Gulf affairs very, very closely. Where do the Gulf oil producers and gas producers, obviously Qatar is a big one, where do they stand in this crisis? I mean, you know, we see a shortage. We've already seen declines from Russia even before sanctions. You know, the 3 million is roughly what, more than half of their crude oil exports. So oil exports, sorry, because I think it's 7 million of crude oil plus oil products. So it's a big decline, and yet they're still standing firm. So is there enough capacity in the Gulf? And, you know, what is their stance regarding this developing crisis? Robin?
Yes, thank you, Kate. Thank you, everybody. So I think this question is kind of divided into two parts. You know, does the Gulf have sufficient spare capacity to offset a loss of Russian supplies, and will it use that spare capacity? So, you know, Adi was giving us some figures, and, you know, 2 or 3 million barrels per day of Russian exports disrupted for now. will that ease up as Russia finds alternative buyers, redirects to India, China, and so on? Will it shrink as there's perhaps a stricter European measures beyond those already announced by the UK and US? Don't mean that could go in either direction, but at the moment we're talking perhaps 2.5 million barrels per day of disruptions. We came into this crisis already in a vulnerable position. There's been a very strong demand rebound following COVID around the world, and not so much of a supply rebound. The non-OPEC producers, the US and so on, I mean, that's down to underinvestment and caution by oil companies. But in the Gulf and in the OPEC plus countries in general, it's very much down to deliberate policy, bringing back production very, very cautiously, and after a pretty severe shock in 2020. However, in recent months, it's become increasingly apparent that the demand was very strong, but also that OPEC was falling short of meeting its own targets. So there's some weaker members that have problems with production. Again, they're suffering from a legacy of underinvestment and so on. That really applied particularly to Angola and Nigeria. They were persistently falling short, and as a result, the OPEC Plus group as a whole is now somewhere around 800,000 barrels per day, short of where its own self-proclaimed targets would put it. And it's now in a kind of straitjacket because it plans to increase production by about 400,000 barrels per day each month. It reaffirmed that at its last meeting last Wednesday. But Saudi Arabia, UAE, a few other members can go ahead and make those production increases, but other members can't live up to it. And of course, as production goes higher and higher, more and more members hit their ceiling. So in fact, we were already seeing signs before this crisis that Russia had probably pretty much hit its maximum without more investment. And several other OPEC Plus members are there too. So really, pretty much all the spare capacity now is concentrated in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and a little bit in Iraq, a little bit in Kuwait. And then the rest of the spare capacity is in places which can't really use it, like Libya and Iran. That where it may or may not be able to come back to the market, but there's other factors obviously getting in the way there. So between Saudi Arabia, UAE, depending exactly where you peg their spare capacities, you may have between 3.5 to 4 million barrels per day of spare capacity, all told. UAE is increasing production capacity. That will creep up over time. Saudi also, but over a longer time span. But for the next few months, that's what we're working with, 3.5 or 4 million. So if we're losing the oil from Russia, yes, in principle, it could all be replaced. But that would mean that the other OPEC Plus countries have pretty much got to go flat out. And Saudi Arabia in particular has almost never done that outside extreme emergencies. Now, then the question is obviously, will they want to do this? And then you get the realm of partly of politics. What is their attitude towards the US? What's their attitude towards Russia? And then you get into their view of the market and their view of the OPEC Plus relationship. How much do they value the OPEC Plus framework to risk disrupting it? They would obviously have to go against the Russian viewpoint, which presumably is no extra production is needed. They'd have to go against other members who can't increase production and therefore don't see any benefit from raising the overall ceiling. And they would have to decide, is it in their interest? A price spike is not generally thought to be good for the major producers in the long term. Yeah, it's nice in the short term, but it hits demand. It risks recession. It risks alternative supplies, encouraging non-oil technologies and so on, and so risks a longer term slump down the road. So a lot of moving parts, and that explains why at the last meeting that they decided not to increase production beyond their usual scheduled increases.
And of course, we've also had disruption from Libya, which has sort of been going up and down for years now, and they've had force majeure. So the market is even tighter than it might have been. Iran nuclear talks, one day we hear they're closed. Today, the French foreign ministry is saying actually, the prospects are dimming. So, but even then, Iran isn't going to be immediate. I want to turn to gas as well before Naji goes into sort of more detail on Qatar, because, as one of the biggest exporters of LNG, along with the US and Australia, Qatar may have a role to play, but perhaps not immediately. More US LNG, maybe Nord Stream 2 is dead at the moment, maybe not buried yet, but likely to be in the immediate term. But in the Middle East, we've seen a surge in gas demand. We've seen a lot of countries, Kuwait, Oman is an importer. A lot of them are net importers, apart from Saudi Arabia, are net importers of pipeline gas or LNG. So where do you see the gas market generally? Do they have any spare to supply Europe?
Well, I think at the moment, no. I mean, yeah, there's been some maintenance on plants and so on. That those will no doubt come back. But you know, with the LNG spot LNG price at $60 in a BTU, or you know, $360 a barrel of oil equivalent, the incentive is there for run absolutely flat out. So, you know, could they squeeze out a few more cargoes in the absolute extremity, perhaps? But there's really not much that they can do. You know, Qatar's obviously the big exporter. Oman and UAE also export LNG in smaller amounts, but no, I think they're all doing the very best that they can. In the longer term, of course, there's some production expansions on the way, but you're talking 2025, 26 before those will hit the market.
Yeah, I'm going to turn to Naji, but again, you know, if you look at the projects from which the energy majors, you know, the international majors have pulled out of Russia, a lot of them are LNG, you know, future LNG projects. So I'm going to turn to Naji because obviously Qatar is expanding its LNG production capacity from 77 million to 110, I think 126 eventually before the end of the decade. So Naji, can you tell us the state of play in Qatar, having spent a lot of time there as an advisor, senior advisor?
Thank you. Yes, permit me to talk a little bit because I am the only one talking about gas, maybe. Qatar is expanding, as you rightly said, but we have to remember that Qatar is expanding into two phases. The first phase will be in 2026, adding 33 million tons to the 77 million already existing, and an additional 16 million tons in 2027. Then we will not have the 126 million tons of capacity before 2026-27. This is very important to notice. And LNG export from Qatar has been mainly destined to Asian markets, Japan, South Korea, China, and India. But also Qatar has given full attention to European markets. Last year, for example, around 22 million tons of Qatari LNG landed in Europe, of which 6.5 in the UK, 5 in Italy, 2 in Spain, and 2 in Belgium. In addition, we have to say that Doha has been investing into 2 main LNG receiving terminals in Europe, the South Hook in the UK, and the Adriatic terminal in Rovigo in Italy. Moreover, Qatar Petroleum, or Qatar Energy now, have been recently booked the full liquefaction capacity of the Zeebrugge terminal in Belgium, which is 9 million tons per year, around 7 million tons of capacity of national grid grain terminal in the UK, and 3 million tons of capacity in Montoir-le-Bretagne in France. Can Qatar provide additional LNG to Europe in case of any supply constraints? This is the main question. In fact, to substitute for possible disruption of Russian gas supply, Qatar could play a role, but a limited one. This must be very clear. Indeed, Qatar is now producing at near maximum capacity, with much of that supply already tied up in long-term contracts. If Qatar was to send all its uncontracted supplies to Europe, the total would be really nothing, almost of 30 or 100,000 cubic meters per day, which is really representing a mere fraction of the Russian supply. It is true that from now till 2026, many Qatari LNG long-term contracts will expire, totaling around 14 million tons, but almost 50% of these volumes have been allocated to European markets. Therefore, only 6 to 7 million tons of additional Qatari LNG, if any, could be reallocated to European markets before 2027. Back to our present situation, there is an urgent need to convince Qatar to reroute some of its current Asian LNG supplies to Europe, the same way it did in 2011 by rerouting LNG to Japan after the tsunami. The US is aggressively facilitating this discussion between Doha and its Asian LNG buyers to discuss the possible release of some cargoes to Europe. Even President Biden invited in February the Emir of Qatar, the Qatari Emir, Sheikh Tamim, to precisely discuss this item, while proposing even to designate Qatar as a major non-NATO ally. But we have to remember that rerouting LNG cargoes would require to compensate Qatar and the client countries as well, which are not likely to be pleased by getting less LNG than planned. Anyway, to divert cargoes from Asia to Europe, Qatar is seeking guarantees that its LNG would not be resold later outside Europe on the spot market. And Doha is also asking the resolve of a long-running European probe into its LNG long-term gas contracts. However, these potential discussions on this item could prove to be extremely difficult as they go to the core of the liberalization of the European gas markets. With all that in mind, it is clear that Qatar has no magic wand to fix shortfall in European gas, and that there are many challenges to overcome in order to get just a tiny LNG assistance from Doha. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Naji. I was actually going to ask you as well. I mean, what are the other alternatives looking ahead into the sort of medium and longer terms? We have Algeria, which is linked by pipelines to Italy, to Spain, but they're maxed out. I don't think in the immediate they can. And you've also done a big paper on East Mediterranean gas. You know, obviously we've got we've got Israel, we've got Cyprus, Egypt, and we're seeing the beginnings of a gas hub. But is there a chance that these pipelines to Europe will materialize? I mean, or is it a pipe dream?
You see, Kate, the problem is timing. From now, you need LNG now, you need gas now. In the medium term to long term, I believe the US would play a major role. The US as an energy exporter will be the main provider or supplier of gas to Europe. This is my belief. The East Mediterranean region, why not? But it will stay marginal for many reasons, because most of the gas in the region will be provided or will be supplied to regional markets. Yeah. And because of so many geopolitical problems in supplying that gas from this region, poor region to Europe.
Yeah, and of course, Lebanon is one of the countries suffering from this shortage and is going to be importing hopefully soon. I'm going to go back to Adi now and talk about whether this pullout of the Western majors from Russian energy projects, is that going to have a longer term impact? I mean, we always hear about Russia saying, well, we can't really cut production very much because it's very difficult to switch it back on again because of the nature of the fields. And the same with gas. I mean, is it going to have a longer term impact? Is it going to weaken Russia as a great energy power? Because, their economy may not be bigger than Italy's. I think I've read that somewhere. I've heard it somewhere. But at the same time, as an energy power, they are a supergiant. So is that going to have a longer term impact? And are we going to see this sort of, we've already been warning about investment shortfalls in upstream that are going to have an impact. We saw it in 2014, 2015, when the price crashed. We saw it again in 2020. We've had a few years, we've had about 5 years of underinvestment in new capacity. So is that going to make for a much tighter market, especially with, or is the transition going to be stepped up? Are the investments going to be available for the transition and therefore keep a sort of lid on demand growth? Adi?
Thanks, Kate. Well, I think I had a chat with somebody last week, I think it was Straits Times in Singapore, asking me about the stock project that Trafigura has. And Trafigura basically said they were going to freeze it. And my immediate question was, What does that mean? Are you going to put, is Trafigura going to put any money? I mean, when you saw those pictures on TV, you're going to put $100 million and give it to Putin? I think it's very unlikely. And of course, you know, behold, they basically stopped investing any money. The majors would be essential for the recovery of the Russian oil and gas sector. Absolutely essential in terms of investment, technology, and so on. Exxon, Mobil, and Shell behind particularly Sakhalin-1, Sakhalin-2 projects. It's been huge. You know, I can go on. Just closing Shell closing 500 petrol stations doesn't sound like a big deal, but it doesn't look well in Russia. I think it's going to be a devastating effect on Russia. I'm not an upstream person, but they lack technology and they do lack capital. Without it, as Robin mentioned early on, already we are seeing Russia hitting the wall. In fact, in many ways, I think OPEC+, in terms of pure volumes, is defunct. I just don't see any point of OPEC+ because, you know, OPEC, as again, sort of Robin mentioned, are the only guys who can actually supply anything to the market. Russia's hit the wall, and you know it can only go down from here. So essentially, I think, you know, to answer your question, I think it's going to have a devastating effect.
I think there was a question. Yeah, somebody was asking, what is it going to take for Saudi Arabia to open the taps? I mean, I was in Saudi Arabia a couple of weeks ago, moderating at another conference, and I was talking to an engineer from Aramco, and he said, yes, of course we can go up to 11 million. You know, we can sustain, but at what cost to our reservoirs? And I think that's one of the major problems. You know, they say they have 12.5 million barrels a day of capacity, but if you look at the neutral zone, it's not producing 1 million to give them that 500,000 extra in addition. Yes, Aramco is investing in new capacity, but again, it's going to come gradually. So I think there is, you know, there's a technical side to it, and also I think they are worried about the fallout with Russia.
But Kate, I think there's also a political aspect to it. Exactly, fallout with Russia. I think they're probably behind the curve there. If I was advising them, I would just say, like, look, you're supporting a totally losing side in that respect. And the other point is, you know, Saudis are the ones who are the Fed of the oil market, and they really need to step up. That's my personal opinion. They need to step up and just say, well, you want to stabilize the market, please go ahead and do so. And OPEC should do that, especially because I think OPEC Plus is, as I said, technically defunct. You know, it's now we're back to OPEC, and I think OPEC does need to show some responsibility towards the oil market.
And before we go into the questions asked, because I can see questions coming in, I was going to invite one of my colleagues at MEES, who's very knowledgeable on Iran, because obviously a lot of people are looking at Venezuela now, at Iran as a potential, you know, supplier, even though we're not really sure where the nuclear talks are going, where they're heading, and even then, and Iraq as well. So I don't know if Raymond, you can bring in Yassar to bring audio to Yassar so that he can give us an update on what's going on with Iran and Iraq capacity, because Iraq might have the capacity to produce more, but they have bottlenecks which prevent them from actually getting supply to market. Yassar, I see your name, please.
Hi, hello, Kate. Thank you very much for inviting me. You're too kind, and hello to everybody. Special hello to Robin, of course, old friend. I mean, let's take it one by one. For Iran, the short answer is for anyone who's looking for immediate releases or replacement of Russian barrels, I think Iran is not the answer. So the long answer to this is we have to look at this in stages. So back in 2016, when the JCPOA was signed, the nuclear deal, no acronyms, sorry, we had something called the finalization day, and we have something called the implementation day. Between each of those, we had 6 months. Now the idea is that we are going to compress that into 3 months. So we have 3 thorny issues at the moment: the IAEA probe, what we are hearing is that this is going to be finalized by re-implementation day, which is June, so 3 months from now. There is the guarantees that Iran wants in case of a snapback, and also there is now a new issue, which is the Russians asking for assurances. So these are the big ifs, the moving parts to what we could call as finalization day or inking the agreement. So when we ink that agreement, what happens? We have 3 months verifications. The Iranians are supposed to reduce their enrichment. The Russians have to be involved in this because they have to take all the enriched material. And we have 3 months to re-implementation day, which again should be in June. But what happens in those 3 months? Will the US allow oil buyers to have waivers like it did before? Or are they able to sign preliminary agreements and contracts with the Iranians on the premise that, we are going to have a deal? Now, if we have waivers, Iran has at least 60 million barrels in floating storage at 1 million barrels per day. That could be 60 days of 1 million barrels per day of exports. Will that cover the Russian barrels lost? I mean, one of the gentlemen who was speaking, he said it's very fussy. So we don't know, is it 1 million, 2 million, 3 million barrels of Russian oil that is lost? Now, what happens if we reach a re-implementation day? Well, that is when Iran is supposed to start putting barrels to the market. Now, Mr. Aoji, who is the petroleum minister, he says he could go to maximum export capacity in 1 to 2 months. So that is 1.3 million to 1.5 million above the average 1 million barrels per day that is being exported now. Although, keep in mind that in February, they were below 1 million barrels per day. But this is all very questionable. Can Iran add 1.3 to 1.5 by August, September? I don't think so. I think we are looking at maximum 1.3 million barrels, excluding, of course, the floating barrels by year end. Now, one final thought on Iran. Current production capacity is 2.55 million barrels per day. The Iranians want to go to 5 or 5.7 million barrels per day in a decade. So by 2030, they need 90 billion for that. So the big question is, say we have a deal, are IOCs going in? Because, one of the big problems that we have is we do not know if Iran can ramp up its domestic production because they need technology and financing. So there is, let's all keep in mind that even if we have a deal by 2024, we have another president coming in the US, and that has to be taken into consideration into project economics by IOC. So we don't know who the next president is. It might be Trump, might be Biden, it might be Mike Pence, Oprah Winfrey. You never know. The Americans always throw a good curveball. But, there is always a space for the Russians and the Chinese to go in and help the Iranians. So that's on Iran.
Thank you, Yassar. Yeah, I think we'll skip Iraq because we know they've got the capacity, but whether they can bring supply to the market is another story. I wanted to invite Ambassador Frank Wisner, who has a question, and he's obviously on the board of the Institute. So Ambassador Wisner, please go ahead with your question.
You're very thoughtful. I hope I'm coming through.
Yes, you are.
Good. Thank you so much. I apologize. My question is rather small bore given the extensive discussion we're having, but I wanted to come back to our friend from Naji, our friend from Qatar, and talk for just a minute about perspectives in the Eastern Mediterranean. You described them as marginal. You're right. They're extremely complex. How do you get gas? Involves Egypt, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. It's a web of understandings before even the regional markets can be satisfied. How complex do you believe that process is going to prove to be? Second, there's one thing today, and then there's tomorrow. If you look out, say 5 years, can you see a significant move in Eastern Mediterranean gas to make the area a potential hub for supply to Europe?
Thank you, Ambassador. Naji, could you take this?
Thank you so much, Ambassador. As you rightly said, it is a very complex situation. Now, Israel is providing its gas to Egypt in order to to let the two LNG liquefaction plants working and supplying marginal LNG to the market. In addition, Egypt is really relying more and more on Israeli gas after relying on its own gas from Zohr and from the Nile Delta. But the highly subsidized gas consumption inside Egypt is eating almost everything. Is eating everything in Egypt. Israel has at one stage to really think about exporting its gas through its own channel, LNG from a terminal at the Mediterranean coast, or if the situation will permit, and we saw that peace is slowly taking place in this region. We never thought that the Emirates, for example, will talk with Israel about energy cooperation. Maybe in the future, in 1 year time, we can see the Saudis talking to the Israelis about some energy cooperation. And the western part of Saudi Arabia is in bad need of gas. Why not pumping Israeli gas to Saudi Arabia, for example? These kind of things could materialize, but it needs peace. It needs also long-term vision and people who are thinking really about long term.
Yeah, political will as well. And of course, it's not only a question of the fact that there is gas, being produced in Egypt, but there's also very steep decline rates. The future could be linking, a tie-in between the Israeli Leviathan gas field and Aphrodite in Cyprus, offshore Cyprus, when that happens, when they can, unitize the...
You see, Kate, we have been hearing about the pipelines from Cyprus to Egypt since more than 5 years, and nothing happened.
No, I know.
And they are talking about these East-Med gas pipeline to Europe, but I believe this is a pipe dream. And now maybe with the rapprochement between Israel and Turkey, things could move in a good direction and channel the East Mediterranean gas through the Turkish network to Europe.
Yeah, well, maybe Eni will now be interested since they've pulled out of the Blue Stream, haven't they? The pipeline from Russia to Greece. One of the things that Yasar just mentioned, Iran, and the fact that Iran is already exporting, but they found a sort of lifeline in China. China was buying crude. I mean, if you look at the official numbers from China, the Chinese customs figures, they showed that basically all of Oman's production went to China, which of course it didn't, because the volumes are too high. So some of this Iranian oil has been masquerading as Omani, as Malaysian oil. And China's been importing. I think there was one cargo that actually appeared officially, but it did provide Iran with a lifeline. So I wanted to ask maybe Robin and Adi, what is China's position? Because obviously they've got pipelines importing gas and crude oil from Russia, and it's probably easier to carry on with pipeline imports. We've seen exports of gas through Ukraine haven't been interrupted, which is sort of surprising, but they're still carrying on. If those were cut off, I think Europe would be in deep trouble. So where does China stand? And is it, there is a relationship which has been growing, and we saw it just before the Beijing Olympics with Putin visiting Beijing and, standing next to Xi. So is that, who are the allies now who are going to come to Russia's rescue? And can they? Adi first, and then Robin, maybe?
Sure, Kate. Yeah, I mean it's still very, very fluid. I think. I think what we understand in the institute here is that Chinese view is very pragmatic. They will stick with their position unless they have to change it. At the moment, I don't think they want to change anything, and they feel very, very vulnerable. Let's face it, China is importing hell of a lot of oil. highly dependent on oil imports, including gas. So I think they feel very, very vulnerable, and they're just sitting there tight and worried about their energy supplies. I don't think that high oil prices and gas prices are particularly good for them either. So they would ideally like to see the end of this war in Ukraine as soon as possible. Again, that's my guess, but it's certainly not serving. The whole success of China in the last 2 decades has been on the international trade sector, and they are highly dependent on the imports of energy and exports of all the other products for the rest of the world. So I think overall, China is highly dependent on the imports. I think China is quite worried about the whole situation. I don't think they're particularly happy about the whole situation. Let's face it, they were the first to bid up the LNG market prior to Europe coming in and buying with Asian benchmark well exceeding TTF over here in Europe. So the situation is quite fluid, and I think they would really be at some stage maybe even a mediator in this conflict, because it does not serve China overall.
Yeah, we've had some interesting mediators, offers of mediation. There's the Turkey talks, which I don't think seem to have gone very much. Israel is trying to mediate. I mean, all these countries that have been on the bench in a way. We have a lot of questions coming in, so I'm going to get at them. Maybe Robin, if you want to add something very quickly on the China angle, and then we move on to the Q&As, which are coming in quite fast.
Yeah, well, firstly, will China be a buyer of last resort for Russian oil? Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure they will, as they were for the and they are for Iran.
For a price, no?
At a price, and for big discounts. And would they take it all if Russian oil is really sells to others and really cut back very seriously? But they'll take a substantial amount. I think the interesting question is longer term. Look, I think one outcome of this is that Russia becomes a much more subservient to China, becomes much more tied into the Chinese economic system. This war and the sanctions on Russia have just demonstrated Russian weakness very, very clearly. The Europeans are clearly going to try and disengage from Russian energy. So where else can it go? That particularly applies to the gas side. But if you're China, do you want to make yourself dependent on a Russia which has now shown itself to be so unreliable and so volatile? The Chinese have deliberately not signed up for Russian gas that in a bidding war against Europe. The Russian gas that goes to China is not connected to the European system, and the Chinese have so far resisted any the pipeline projects that would do that. So I think that is a key outcome this year. As a Russia that finds that Beijing really calls the shots on what it will and will not allow.
And there's an excellent paper actually on the Oxford Institute website, if anybody wants to see it, on the China's role in all of this. Before I get to the other questions, somebody wanted to ask about what each country has in terms of spare capacity. I did do a paper for the Arab Gulf Institute, which is actually on the website, which gives a breakdown of what each country has. And I think the total comes out to about 4 million, most of it in Saudi Arabia. And the rest of it in UAE, very little, about 200,000 in Kuwait, about 600,000 in Iraq, and the rest so the numbers are there. And also somebody wanted me to refer to the IEA stock release, which is only the fourth in its history. It's 60 million barrels a day, didn't really do much for the market. The market went up afterwards because it was deemed to be too little, too late. And again, I suppose that raises a question of, okay, if the IEA is saying this is an initial release of 60 million barrels a day out of maybe 100 million barrels a day of demand of total supply, and they're saying maybe more coming if warranted. What can OPEC do with their, 4 million barrels a day of spare capacity, technically? Is that going to make a difference if the IEA is putting all this oil on the market? It doesn't seem, it seems to be more a sort of, OPEC Plus can actually message and say, yes, we can do it. And if the market doesn't need it, then you don't. But obviously now you have Russia as well disrupted. So the IEA stock release hasn't really had that much of an impact, but we'll see what happens. Obviously, it was accompanied for the first time with these 10-point plans on how Europe can reduce its dependence on gas, Russian gas, and eventually and oil. And that's the first time they've actually done it. But that's also going to be, that's going to take time. So I'm going to go straight to the questions. I think we've answered the question about what would persuade Saudi Arabia to pump more oil. I think nothing is going to persuade Saudi Arabia. Adi, do you think there's anything that will persuade them to pump more oil?
Okay, it's more a political question. I think probably a call from Biden would probably make a bit of a difference. But
yeah, but there was a Wall Street Journal story recently saying that they had rebuffed that they had not that MBS Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, and the Crown Prince of UAE had not taken a call from President Biden, which again has not been confirmed officially. But yeah, as you said, it's more political. But I think also it's a sovereign decision, which is what they always say. And we're not going to eat somebody else's pie if others can't produce, for one reason or another, force majeure, but weather disruption, etc., geopolitics, and we're not going to be making up for it because
but Kate, what really worries me here is that in the past the Saudis always had this very long picture, long-term thinking, and at the moment it seems to me it's all about short-term revenue maximization, which I'm not sure it's actually going to help Saudi Arabia long term and oil market in the long term.
No, because their policy is to always hold 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day of spare production capacity for such events, at all times. And yeah, so it's sitting there. So somebody's asking, in addition to Middle East LNG, is it possible to expand short distance deliveries of African LNG from Egypt, Algeria? I think we've answered that, Nigeria, among others, to Northern and Southern Europe for displacement? No, I think we've answered that. We also have some greenfield projects that aren't proceeding at the moment. Mozambique is one example. We may have, I think, about 9 million tons coming online in 2022 from the US, and I think the Tangguh project as well, Indonesia. But that's, again, presumably these are all projects that were concluded with long-term contracts in place. And for Qatar, there's also the problem of the destination clauses with the EU. So that's, I think
maybe I can add, Kate, by saying that Iran, we are only focusing on the oil aspects. Maybe we have also to look at the gas. Iran has the second largest reserves in the world, and they have ambition to be a gas player. I believe when the door will be open for Iran, they will play a big role. Don't forget that they have the south part, which is almost equivalent to the North Field in Qatar, and they would play a role. But again and again, timing is the main problem here.
Well, exactly. They're a bit late. I mean, they had all these LNG plants. I mean, at one point, I think Total was involved, Repsol was involved. And I remember being in Abu Dhabi. I was in Abu Dhabi many years ago at one of these big conferences. I think it was maybe ADIPEC, and there was an Iranian LNG stall, and they were giving away these bags, bright yellow bags with Iran LNG on them. And when I opened the bag afterwards, there was a sort of big yellow thing that looked like an octopus, and it was a massage machine, neck massager. And I thought, this is so weird. And of course, none of them went anywhere because the sanctions meant that. And one of the points I made today in an insight I wrote for MEES is that it wasn't the direct sanctions that hurt, it was the secondary sanctions that hurt Iran, because they couldn't export because their buyers were afraid of the secondary sanctions imposed by the US. And of course, we can't rule out the fact that this is going to happen again. But yes, as you say, Iran is a very minor exporter of pipeline gas to Turkey, to Iraq, to
Armenia.
Yes, my country. But again, I mean, we've had this situation in Europe where we've had shutdowns, nuclear plants being shut down. We've had very low gas storage. The UK doesn't have gas storage at all. And if we have to draw from storage now, we're going to be in big trouble in the winter. So yes, we're going to need all the gas we can get. And that's really, in a way, depends on Russia continuing supplies through Nord Stream 1 is still running, I think, and through Ukraine. But again, we don't know what countermeasures Moscow is going to take in response to these tightening sanctions. And they're coming, every day we've got new sanctions. So I have a question from markets, given the political implications of supply disruptions, what's the optimal way, both in the short and the long run, to avoid future disruptions? Is this something we can answer now? I mean, more investment. Is it going to mean that the financial institutions are going to put aside the ESG requirements for investment in fossil fuel projects and in hydrocarbons at this time of, because we are in an emergency?
I mean, I'd like to weigh in on this one, Kate. Look, yeah. I think in the short term, and assuming that the West wants to impose a cost on Russia for this invasion and try to push back against it, there is no alternative. You know, you cannot replace 7.5 million barrels a day of oil exports and 200 BCM of gas exports and substantial amounts of coal. There isn't. We've heard that from all the proposed solutions. There's very limited spare capacity for any of those fuels. The IEA, of course, and others have presented ways that you could cut, maybe, if you're very ambitious, you could cut European requirement for Russian gas imports by 1/3 by the end of the year. I see a lot of talk about that. I don't see any action. I'm like, guys, you have 8 months to do this. You cannot spend 6 months discussing these policies before you actually try to put them into place. This needs to be a crash program. Even then, you know, there's no way around shortages and high prices. And I think it's also the debate at the moment is still very much anchored on, you know, half the people say, well, this shows that the whole green thing was a mistake and we need more fossil fuels. And the other half say, you know, if this shows that the fossil fuels are the problem and we need, you know, we need more renewables and efficiency, you know, and the answer is that everybody's correct. You know, we need to throw everything at this problem and actually have a sense of urgency about this instead of trying to knock down some of the solutions. And accept that, you know, we're in a very significant energy crisis and it'll touch Europe worst of all. But, you know, on the oil side, it will affect the US and it will affect other oil consumers significantly as well.
I mean, is that going to speed up the energy transition? Is that going to mean, you know, more solar, more wind? But again, you know, we had wind that stopped, so we had the crisis in Europe when there was no wind blowing, there was not enough storage, and there was a tight LNG market, and prices were already rising towards records. I mean, now they're sort of, you know, are we going to see more switching? Is oil cheaper than gas at the moment, even at close to 120? Or are we going to see a faster transition? Because people are going to say, you know what, the sun is always going to shine, the wind will blow, we have storage options, hydrogen. I don't know how this is going to play out, but I would assume that people will be looking at it and saying, you know, we can't just carry on the way we are. The system is broken. Maybe we moved a bit too quickly before the system was ready to absorb all these interruptible supplies. But at some point, we need to sort of, you know, we need to electrify more. And but what's going to run this electricity?
Well, I think, you know, this shows us we didn't move fast enough. Europe's moved fast in other regions, but nobody moves fast enough. But there was also not enough attention. You know, all the classic prescriptions of energy security that we discovered so painfully after '73 and the IEA has propounded, you know, were forgotten in the rush for decarbonisation. So we should have decarbonised faster. We should have gone to renewables and electric vehicles and all of that faster. But at the same time, we should not have forgotten that the need to keep the oil and the gas supplies very adequate and diversified through that process as well. You know, and that's really a mistake that we're encountering now. And this is not, as I've said, this is not something that will be solved in the next 8 months. This is a prospect of years to solve this problem. But we have to start on it now. And absolutely, it will accelerate the energy transition, undoubtedly. But it's going to mean a very bumpy and uncomfortable ride.
Yeah. But look at UAE. I mean, you know, they've got nuclear, and that's really, we've seen a fall in gas use for power generation because the third unit, I think, at the Barakah nuclear power plant is on now. So I think we see it in the numbers.
Absolutely, and the nuclear plants, when they're all up and running in the UAE, will save 10 BCM a year of gas, which is highly material. And the UAE has just announced a new LNG expansion and a couple of new trains of LNG plant, which will add quite significantly to its exports. But this is, you know, this will happen by 2026-7. It's not an instant solution. But absolutely, of course, if you view this from the point of view of the energy exporters, the non-Russian exporters, they're in a very good position for the next few years. You know, their challenge is to capitalize on this, spend the windfall wisely, but also recognize that if anything, this, as we've just said, this is going to hasten the transition. So a few good years, but then they need to put the money away for for an accelerated low carbon transition.
Okay, I'm going to take a couple more questions. I'm going to use my prerogative. I've been told that we can go slightly over. I see an old friend here, a very dear friend, basically saying, you know, if we increase production, you know, all these calls to increase production, isn't that going to erode spare production capacity? Isn't that going to be bullish for markets? Adi, you're a former trader. I mean, when you have razor thin capacity, which is already, it's going to decline even as OPEC gradually increases by this 400,000. It is going to be eroded, you know, by September when they restore all these barrels they withdrew in 2020 fully. Is that going to be? I mean, I've heard you say that you're surprised that markets were trading at, you know, weren't trading at
$90 when they were trading $90 2 weeks ago. Yeah, because exactly. I was expecting to trade at 120, 130. And I still expected to trade probably 120 and 130 unless there's a change in the situation in Ukraine, because I actually think it's just getting messier and messier unless there is some, and I really, really hope there's some breakthrough in that sort of arrangement.
I mean, can they go high? Can they go even higher than they are at the moment? I mean,
absolutely. I think we were doing some modeling at the Institute, and I think, you know, if we lose up to 5 million barrels of Russian crude, we could easily, by April, see prices of about $150.
Yeah.
The problem with this idea of spare capacity, it's not the spare capacity that sets the price. It's supply and demand that set the price. Spare capacity is residual. I think people tend to look at it the wrong way around, but it's a very good indicator, and that we use it for statistical purposes to work out sort of where the price should be. So, yeah, I mean, you know, look, I think at the end of the day, just going back to what Robin just said, it's very hard to disagree. I think we're going to move on to other things, but in the short term, there's not many other things. What's going to happen is going to be a major demand destruction, you know, and it's not going to be about Europe. Europe, yes, directly is going to be affected because of the trade flows, but essentially because we are in an oil market, which is one great pool, the whole market is going to be disrupted. As a result of lack of, for example, gasoline components coming out of Russia and going into maybe Rotterdam or UK, Brazil is going to suffer, because Brazil is a big market for gasoline and sort of components. So the whole world is going to be affected. One point, Kate, is that, look, there's plenty of oil at a price. Okay, so at $130 a barrel, you get your oil. And I think what's going to happen in Europe, when people say, oh, Europe's going to be affected, hell no, that's something we haven't been talking about enough. It's the third world, the poorer countries are going to be affected, especially the countries with really poor policies, such as Egypt, where you subsidize a lot of your products. They are going to hurt because they have bad economic policies. So what's going to happen is that prices will go up. Europe is a rich part of the world, and they can afford it. And Europe, more than anyone else, will just bid up, TTF over JKM. They'll bid up Brent over WTI in Dubai, and they'll get what they want. And Europe can afford it. What we are not talking about is the rest of the world that can't afford it, and they won't get it. So I think at the end of the day, Europe will be just fine. It will be hurting at very high prices, but, you know, I worry about global economy, especially developing world.
Well, filling up my car hurt the other day. I think electric is the future. But one last question before I let you all go. And it's a question that's come up, you know, in the sort of political debate in the US, as well as now a question we've had about, you know, will Canadian oil play any role? Maybe a restart of the Keystone XL pipeline, which of course was scrapped or frozen or whatever it is. You know, Biden's policy, he came into office saying it was going to be a green administration with $1 trillion plus invested in clean energy and, you know, scrapping of drilling on federal lands, etc. But yes, I mean, a lot of people are asking, and I heard a Senate debate recently, basically a committee debate, basically saying, why are we calling on Saudi Arabia and Venezuela and others to produce more oil when we have Canada, you know, at the doorstep? We also have Mexico. And yes. Well, the Permian's growing. And again, we haven't really gotten into what will happen to shale, what would happen. We are going to see increases maybe from offshore Brazil, deep offshore Brazil. But, there are also declines. We have natural decline. We have to already. But yes, Canadian oil, you think, does anybody think that that some of these policies might be reversed, that were preventing more Canadian crude from, because obviously that also, some of it is heavy, can be blended, so you don't need to go to Venezuela to get it, or Russia.
Well, I'll just quickly step in. I mean, going back to history, I think, again, I think OPEC is making a very, very big mistake. They're going back to 1970s, late 70s, where, the high oil prices just caused what we saw in mid 80s. And that's going to may well happen. You just basically causing yourself a big trouble, because you're motivating everyone else, waking up shale, Canada, Brazil, everyone else when they come out. And then you probably at the same time have to face all these green policies, trying to get away from carbon. I think it's going to be, might well be a bit of a disaster. But these early days, I don't want to look that far out. But I think it's a big mistake. I think OPEC should be there to stabilize this market as soon as possible, and they can. If we can get a couple of million barrels from OPEC right now, we can get some SPR oil. I think, yes, there will still be high prices, but every little helps. And I think we'll just manage to get by.
Okay, final words from the other speakers before we close this up. There's
Yeah, Kate, I would like to add a small comment here. Canada could also play a role in gas, especially with high price, considering that Canadian gas development is very expensive, and it could be logic to see some developments there. But I'm wondering, maybe this is a question to everybody, especially to Ali, why little has been heard about shale oil and shale oil in the US, especially now with the high oil price? Nobody is talking about any revival of shale oil in the US.
I could just very quickly say, I think that one of the problems with shale has been consolidation. Consolidation means essentially monopolization. So what you have is a number of companies like, big players like Chevron. Chevron don't necessarily hedge their production forward. These are small players, very, very small players, that actually what they do, they go to the bank, they borrow the money, they invest the money and hedge forward. People like Chevron don't need that. They don't hedge forward, and they're thinking long term. And I think consolidation and lack of competition in the shale has probably been one of the factors. I'm not saying it's being the key factors. Another factor is, I'm sure the other, Robert may add up, because I know he was talking about that before. All these financial issues. People investing into green stuff and shying away from fossil fuels. But essentially, I think consolidation had a really, really big impact. Now that will change, because now we're seeing massive returns on investments in oil and gas. And I think one way or the other, supply and demand of funds will sort of prevail, and I think we'll see a lot more investment. So I think rather than $500,000 barrel increase this year in shale, I think we're probably more likely to see something close to 1 million. But it's still, just not enough. Not enough. We need Saudis and UAE to step in.
Thank you. And Robin, final words from you. We still have our audience, so they haven't left us yet. We must be doing something right.
Well, look, I think the Canadian thing's interesting. It's emblematic of the whole debate. It's a red herring, right? Canada doesn't have significant spare capacity. If that pipeline was built tomorrow, TC has announced it's not even interested in building the pipeline anymore. That's not what is holding back Canadian production. But I think the wider issue there is that the oil industry and the Biden administration are talking past each other. The Biden administration says, increase production. You have all these unused leases that you're sitting on. It's your responsibility to increase the production. The oil industry says, well, this is all the regulations and that you're putting on us, and you're not holding new lease sales and this kind of stuff. The reality is, the oil industry is not drilling more than they are today because of shareholder pressure and as Adi rightly says, consolidation, and all the CEOs have been beaten over the head by their shareholders saying, don't spend any more money, We don't want another money pit, you know. And even if you did want to increase production, as Yassar just reminded me, you have supply chain constraints, you know, you have fewer workers, you have shortage of steel pipes, you know, all this kind of stuff. But, you know, if we want to tackle this issue from a US point of view, I think that disconnect has to be bridged, and the Biden administration has to say to the oil industry, look, we have a longer term environmental policy that we're going to stick to, but in the short term, you know, we need you guys. We're going to support you. What do you need to overcome these supply chain issues? You know, what can we do as a government to get around that? And the oil industry needs to say, yes, you know, we accept this as an emergency. It's a national emergency. It's a global emergency. We're going to do our bit. We're one of the few places that could increase production significantly over a 6 to 9 months time scale, and it will be very profitable to us at current prices. And yes, we are going to do our best to drill more and produce more. You know, but this talking past each other that we've seen at CERAWeek so far is clearly not productive.
Now, you see, even with CERAWeek, we've had quite a big audience here today. And of course, all this is happening at a time when the industry itself is working on decarbonizing, you know, the circular carbon economy, carbon capture and storage, all that adds to cost as well. So you look at prices now and you look at the additional cost of production in order to produce a sort of lower carbon molecule and barrel. And it's, you know, it's a very, very tough time for the industry. I think we're going to have to end it here because we've gone slightly over, but I think it's been a really interesting discussion. We can go on and on and on, but I want to thank all my speakers for taking the time. I know it's very, very busy for all of us and it's hectic and we're sort of having to keep track of developments by the hour, if not by the day. And I'm sure we're going to be back again talking about this and other issues. So thank you very, very much. And thank you to all the people who joined the discussion today.